The final Kraken-less NHL season is finally underway, although to be fair it did start about a week ago, but what it does mean is that we do have a new season with new stats that I will be able to include in these videos. Obviously keeping in mind though that any stats that I do include for this season will only be about as updated as they were on the day that I recorded each video. And of course, as we do get deeper and deeper into this NHL season, the stats are not going to be the only thing that's constantly changing. Nope, we do have to keep in mind that a number of these rosters will also have quite a bit of turnover before the expansion draft rolls around. And when it does come to rosters that I would expect to look different in June from how they do now, the Calgary Flames are certainly one of those teams. So even though I know the day is coming where I record one of these videos and then either during editing or right after I release the video, the team that I made it about makes a big trade, there's nothing I can really do about that, so here's how the Flames are looking, as of right now anyway, for the expansion draft. By the way, if you do find yourself enjoying this video at any point and you like to enjoy things, the subscribe button can help you out. Over the last few years, the Flames have had some pretty good teams and look to be competitive again this year, and although it's led to nothing in the playoffs other than, I guess, disappointment, it does mean that they have a deep enough roster that Seattle could get a pretty good player from this team. But of course, keeping in mind that when I say they could get a pretty good player, I'm talking about like a league average second or third line level player and not a Matthew Tkachuk, for example. Because again, obviously, as we do get to the players I think the Flames are likely to protect, Tkachuk is an obvious lock. And then joining Tkachuk as far as protected forwards for the Flames are concerned, I do think that Elias Lindholm and Sean Monahan are pretty much locks, as well as Johnny Gaudreau. Although I do know that there are some Flames fans that would like to see more from Gaudreau this season, and if he doesn't show that, he could be on the trading block. But at least as far as I'm concerned anyway, if he isn't traded, I do think he gets one of the protected spots for the Flames. I also think that it's pretty likely that Andrew Mangiapane and Michael Backlund get protected, although for Backlund, I do think it's kind of up in the air whether they would go with protecting him or Sam Bennett. And the reason that could be an either or and not both is because of the no movement clause on Milan Lucic. And since for the sake of consistency with these videos, I don't want to get too deep into expecting no movement clauses to get waived, I will have him protected here. But when it comes to Lucic, I do think it's fairly likely he does end up waiving that no movement clause if he's still on the Flames by the time June rolls around. Now, as the guys at Sound of Hockey pointed out in their look at the Flames' approach to this expansion draft, Lucic has waived a no movement clause before when he was traded from Edmonton. So at least with him, there is precedent set to expect that he might be willing to waive it again. Plus, even if he didn't want to come to Seattle, he probably would recognize that based on his performance and his current contract, he would not be a very tempting option for the Kraken to pick up, so it probably wouldn't really end up mattering in the end and would just help the Flames. So while that seventh and final protected slot on the forward end will probably come down to whether or not Lucic is willing to waive that no movement clause, on the defensive end, the third and final spot will probably come down to the performance of Christopher Tanev. And I say that because on the defensive end, I think that Noah Hanifin and Rasmus Andersson are pretty much locks, and then the final spot again will come down to whether or not Christopher Tanev, who came over from the Canucks, can prove that he is worthy of it. If he doesn't, then that third spot probably goes to captain Mark Giordano. And so while I will, at least for now, put Giordano in that third protected spot on the defensive end, I don't think that it's anywhere near out of the question that Tanev could earn his way into it, meaning that there is a possibility that Giordano could be available for the Kraken to select. But while the ex-Canuck from last year, Tanev, will have to fight for his spot on the protection list, another guy that was playing in Vancouver last year definitely will not, and that is Jacob Markstrom. And honestly, I don't think that it really matters what kind of a season Markstrom has this year because he did just sign a 6-year deal with a no movement clause, which would kind of suggest that he was looking towards the expansion draft when it came to signing this contract and decided that he didn't really want to have to worry about whether or not he was going to be leaving. So even if he did have a bad year, I wouldn't necessarily think that he would be overly excited about trying to waive that no movement clause. Not that it really matters too much because I don't think it's terribly likely that he ends up getting outperformed by David Rittich in a shortened season. So as we do now get to the players that could be available for Seattle to pick from the Flames, even though there are some options on the defensive end and even a goalie that I wouldn't hate to see in Seattle, which is not something I could really say about any of the California teams, I do think that the depth of this team and probably where Seattle will be looking most closely is on the forward end. And although there will be plenty of players for Seattle to pick from on the forward end, I do think that it's a fairly limited list that is actually likely to end up in Seattle, really coming down to just 5 players. Those being Andrew Mangiapane, Michael Backlund, and Sam Bennett, who we mentioned earlier, as well as Dylan Dubé and Glenn Godden. Of course, keeping in mind that at least 2 of those guys will be protected, and 3 of them could be protected if Lucic does waive that no movement clause. Now again, I did say earlier that I do expect that especially Backlund and Mangiapane will be protected. And that's because in the case of Mangiapane, at the age of 24, he is in his 4th season in the NHL where he's played 125 games, with 46 points on 25 goals and 21 assists. And last year, he especially looked good in 68 games where he had 32 points with 17 goals and 15 assists. And just to throw a little extra in there with some advanced stats, he also looked very good there with a 53.3 Corsi for percentage last season and a 5 expected plus minus. Meanwhile, at the age of 31, Backlund definitely has some more NHL experience under his belt, with 690 games in his 12 seasons in the league, with 365 points on 150 goals and 220 assists. He's also been a remarkably consistent player over the last few years, with somewhere in the mid-40s to low 50s in points every one of those years. And even when it comes to the advanced stats, at least as far as Corsi for percentage and expected plus minus are concerned, he has also consistently been on the good side of those stats as well. Now, if one of these guys were to slip through the cracks, I do think that it's much more likely that it would be Backlund, and that would probably end up being a case where Calgary has a disappointing season and doesn't really end up being anywhere close to the playoffs, so they decide to go for more of a rebuild, or at least a retool next season, and decide to move on from an older guy like Backlund in favor of maybe a younger player. So then the third guy who, at least at this point, in my opinion anyway, could be the one looking to Rittich to see whether or not he allows him on the protection list would be Sam Bennett, who also, like Mangiapane, is 24 years old, but does have significantly more NHL experience, having played in at least part of what is now 7 NHL seasons with 366 games under his belt, with 128 points on 63 goals and 65 assists in that time. But even with all that extra experience, and in spite of being the same age as Mangiapane, the reason that Sam Bennett to me is a little bit more on the bubble here is because over the last couple of years, he hasn't really had the production, at least points-wise, that you would hope to see, and has definitely been outperformed by Mangiapane. In the 3-year span between 2016-17 and 2018-19, he played in at least 70 games of each one of those seasons, but never managed to score more than 27 points. And then in 52 games last year, all he could get was 12. But it is also fair to mention with Bennett that he still does definitely have the potential to get back to being that player that scored 36 points in 77 games in his rookie season, which you can also see signs of in his advanced stats, as he still does prove to be an above average player when it comes to those. But even if we run with the assumption that Rittich will waive his no movement clause, I still think that Sam Bennett is far from a sure thing to make this protection list, and that's because coming up behind him is Dylan Dubé. Now, what Bennett does have over Dubé, outside of a significant amount of NHL experience, is the fact that he plays a position, being center, that the Flames could definitely use some more help at than the wing, which is where Dubé currently is. But at the age of 22, Dubé is now playing in what is the 3rd season that he has participated in the NHL, with 73 games now to his name, having scored 23 points on 8 goals and 15 assists in those games. So it is fair to mention that 23 points in 73 games is not a particularly good-looking line for Dubé so far to this point in his career. He did look quite a bit better last year with 16 points in 45 games, and it's that improvement over his first season, which definitely left something to be desired, that has some people in the Flames organization pretty excited about what this still 22-year-old could offer them in the future. So for Dubé, who could be looking at fairly significant playing time at the NHL level this season, will need to prove that he can continue that upward trajectory that he started last season in order to earn a spot onto this protection list. But if he does continue to show signs of that improvement and doesn't end up on the protection list, he could very well be the guy that ends up in Seattle from Calgary. But if it is a younger player that Seattle would be looking to get from Calgary, and Dubé ends up on the protection list and Sam Bennett doesn't really look like the player that they would want, then Glenn Gawdin could come into the mix. With Gawdin, it is also fair to mention that even though he is 23, he would probably be more of a prospect pick for Seattle if they went with him, as he has yet to play a game at the NHL level, but has looked pretty good at the AHL level, scoring 47 points in 53 games last season. Now, as we do move on from the forwards to the defensemen from Calgary, again, I do think that it's most likely that Seattle will be taking a forward from this team, mostly because good forwards are going to be harder to come by in the expansion draft than good defensemen, and I just don't know that Calgary will be offering a good enough defenseman to sway the Kraken away from one of these forwards. But that doesn't mean we aren't going to look at a couple of options. And of course, when it comes to defensive options, it's all going to start with which one of Giordano or Tanev is available. Now, with Tanev, it does have to be said that in his 11 years in the NHL at the age of 31, he has not necessarily made a name for himself as a points producer, because in his 517 games, he only has 118 points to show for it, with 22 goals and 96 assists. But the potential draw with Tanev, which you can kind of see in that ratio of goals to assists over the course of his career, is the fact that he has what is considered an exceptional hockey sense or feel for the game, which is definitely something that scouts tend to look for and value in players, even if it is harder to see in the stats. which could potentially pose a problem in Seattle just from the fact that Seattle is very much going to be, by all indications, a data-driven team, but who knows what other potential stats they have available to them and what potential ways that hockey sense might show up in some of those. But his hockey sense and definitely an understanding for the game that he's been able to acquire over 500 plus games in his career is definitely something that he could bring from a veteran perspective to potentially help out a younger team if that is the way the Kraken decide to go. And of course, if Tanev does have a pretty good season for the Flames and can prove that he can be a difference maker in one way or another, and if when it comes to looking at the Flames it's a veteran that Seattle decides they want, there would hardly be a better pick than Giordano if he is available. The longtime Flames captain is now in his 15th year in the NHL, where he's played nearly 900 games, and in that time put up 485 points on 135 goals and 350 assists. So he definitely has proven to be quite a bit more of a points producer over the course of his career than Tanev has, which we definitely saw in action in the 2018-19 season just a couple of years ago when he put up 74 points in 78 games and ended up winning the Norris Trophy. But of course, the one thing that Tanev has that Giordano doesn't is the fact that he's 6 years younger, because at the age of 37, Giordano probably doesn't have a whole lot more time in the league and does seem to be, at least based on last year's stats, starting to slow down a bit. But again, he did just recently win a Norris Trophy, so unless he just falls off a cliff, he still has a few years left in him to at least be a serviceable defenseman. Plus, when it does come to the expansion draft, as tempting as it would be to just pick a whole bunch of younger players with bright futures potentially ahead of them, there are some rules that the Kraken still have to follow regarding players that they'll have to pick that are still under contract for the next season, and how much of the cap they end up taking up, which is certainly an aspect of the expansion draft that Giordano or really even Tanev could help with. Because even though Giordano will be getting almost $7 million in what will be the Kraken's first season, which is a lot of money to pay an aging defenseman that seems to be in a bit of a decline, it is also a contract that will be expiring at the end of that first season for the Kraken, so if they were to pick him, it's not a terribly high-risk contract to take. And even if he doesn't really do anything for the Kraken and they decide that they're not going to re-sign him at the end of that time, then that would mean that they just end up getting $7 million of cap space back for free agency going into the second season. For Tanev, on the other hand, he would cost the Kraken about $4.5 million for the first 3 seasons, so you would want to be a little bit more careful before just picking him up to meet the requirements. And speaking of contracts, as we finish up with goalies, Rittich is set to be a UFA at the end of the season. But since he is a pretty good backup goalie, even if he hasn't proven that he can be a starter to this point in his career anyway, I do think that they'll probably re-sign him at some point this season, so he could also be an option if they end up needing to pick up a contract. And while, like I said earlier, I wouldn't be mad at the idea of Rittich coming over to Seattle as one of the goalies, I do think that there are good enough options elsewhere that Seattle will probably still want to go with one of the forwards. I mean, for Rittich, he has shown a couple of flashes in his few years in the NHL to this point that would suggest he could potentially be a starting goalie down the road, but in each of those opportunities, he kind of didn't continue to earn the spot, and of course, that's how they ended up with Markstrom. So if Seattle were to pick Rittich, I think it would probably have more to do with the fact that they just think they can get more out of him than Calgary has been able to this point, or at least get that level of play that earned him the starting spot a couple of times at a more consistent rate. So as we do finally wrap up, when it comes to the Calgary Flames, forward depth is the name of the game here when it comes to the expansion draft. And even if they do want to go on the forward end and they end up needing a contract and either Backlund or Mangiapane are available, both of them are signed through the Kraken's first season, so they could pick one of them up. And that's even assuming that nobody else gets signed throughout the course of the season, which there's still a lot that remains to be seen there. Finally though, if you have made it to this point in the video, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy it, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below. Otherwise, I would love to hear your thoughts on the Flames and who you think will be protected and who you think the Kraken could end up selecting from this team if, again, nothing changes, which it probably will. Finally though, as always, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace.